Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform. Scott and I are absolutely delighted to be joined in today's episode by Mimi Kwa, who you may recognise from her time as a newsreader in the ABC and I think on some commercial television stations as well in the middle there. She also has written an amazing book, which is a memoir about her family history, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that we discovered when we read Mimi's book is behind that very polished facade of Mimi on the news where life is perfect and every hair's in place, she had quite a chaotic life going on outside, and some family legacies, I suppose, that you're still managing today. So we're really intrigued to find out more about that. And you said, I think in passing in maybe it was a previous interview or on your website, that friends always ask you, Mimi, how can you be so sane given all the conflict that you've been through in your life? And that's something we're really intrigued to find out about too. We're so delighted that you could join us today. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to chat to you both.
So can we pick up on that? How are you so sane from all the drama that you've had in your life, intergenerational drama?
Well, that's something to really spend some time unpacking, isn't it? Because what is this idea of normal? I think the word that friends and people I know have used is, how have you turned out so normal? And I suppose by that they mean, how have you turned out a well-balanced human, all things considered, and a functional person to an extent in this world that we're in. I think, we've all got stuff going on, so there really is no normal. But in terms of being able to be a fairly fully functioning human being, mother, wife, child to my two parents, sister, all of the things that we as people, all of those roles that we feel every day, I feel like I'm managing them as well as the next person. But all things considered, now that my family story is out on the page for people to read, I suppose people are thinking, well, how do you come through that sort of mental dysfunction in a family and then turn out okay? And the answer to that is, I've done a lot of work. So initially, I suppose I turned out okay and became a high achiever because that was my coping mechanism, and I really suppressed all of the trauma and the experiences that had happened to me or had happened around me, and I just got on with things because that was a survival mechanism through my own conditioning and I guess my own personality and figuring out what worked for me. That was how I got through and became what we would conventionally think of as a successful person in my career. But the real functionality or the normality came from me doing the deep inner work, which started off with my psychologist. It turned into a very deep meditation practice. And, they're things that we can talk about today, of course, because I would love to talk about those things. So in other words, there is no short answer to that question. How does anybody turn out the way that they turn out? There are so many variables.
And I think Scott and I both want to talk to you about the meditation and mindfulness, because we've both got a fair bit of experience in that space. So let's definitely talk about that. But I wanted to go back to the beginning first. And one of the things I noticed when I read your book is that there is, or there was, a lot of intergenerational trauma, that a lot of the things that were happening to you as you were growing up as a child really had their roots way back generations before. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the relevance of what happened in past generations to conflict that you experienced in your youth and perhaps still today.
So I think we should just let listeners in on a little bit of a synopsis of the book just to give context. So it starts with my hair turning grey overnight because, and it literally did turn grey overnight, because I received documents from my dad that showed that he was suing me in the Supreme Court of Western Australia. And that would be enough to send anybody, off kilter. So he was suing me over the estate of his late sister, my late auntie, and it wasn't because of the money or possessions, although on the surface it seemed that way. It was really because my dad, being a traditional patriarchal, fairly misogynist Chinese man, did not want in any universe or any dimension of reality a woman, particularly his daughter, to be in charge of anything ahead of him. So my auntie leaving me in charge of her estate was a very empowering thing for me, but my dad saw that as being very disempowering to him. Not that these were concepts that were spoken about at the time. It was essentially him taking me to court over her estate. My dad and my auntie were both siblings in amongst 32 brothers and sisters. So you can get a sense of where the trauma and conflict began, but it began before that, way before that, further than I could even go back in history. The amount of tangible information that I was able to glean to write my book went back to the imperial compound in Beijing in China, where my great grandfather had many wives, and my grandfather left that compound and eventually travelled down to southern China and then to Hong Kong. He was a silk trader. My grandfather, had 32 brothers and sisters, and that number is even contestable because some of the 32 brothers and sisters think there were more. Some say there were a few less. It depends, my dad says, on whether you counted the babies who died, in infancy, um, and adopted. There was an adopted child. Was he counted or not? Was he true Kwa blood or not? There was so many interesting stories that I was able to research for my story. But essentially, what it brought up, and as Scott said, when we were off air before this recording, you could create a spreadsheet on all of the conflict that existed within my family going back generations. So that's kind of the backstory to my dad suing me and to what predicated my own fairly dysfunctional upbringing. My dad in Hong Kong grew up during the Second World War, the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. And so that conflict in itself is something that really impacted my dad and his psyche and his survival instinct. He was only 7 years old when they occupied. And I think everybody's family, everybody can relate to having a family member who has come through war or famine or some sort of terrible hardship in their ancestry that has then epigenetically trickled down within families to cause all sorts of problems, which is why you guys are so helpful and useful in this world.
I feel like you could see a bit of that in your dad's behavior of collecting things that might be useful one day. I think if you've gone through that period of scarcity and when you're fighting for food and things, that it does make sense, doesn't it? To make sure that you've got lots of resources available for you just in case.
Absolutely. And hoarding, I mean, you're very gracious just calling it collecting things in case they might come in handy for a rainy day. But let's call a spade a spade. It's hoarding. And yes, he is the hoarder of all hoarders. I mean, he's had front page articles written about him in the local newspapers, rat infested property, hoarders paradise. He's had neighbours taking photographs over the fence and sending them into the council complaining about my dad's hoarding. And I remember growing up as a child with him. My dad would take me out on a trailer when it was hard rubbish day, and I would call it wombling after the Wombles of Wimbledon, who I think like to collect things. And we would just collect all sorts of things. And I think I joke in the book that be careful if you've left your rake or, your bicycle outside, because my dad will just assume that that's hard rubbish, and onto the trailer it will go and we'll zoom off down the road.
Oh, crikey. Obviously, there's a lot of examples in the book about your dad and some of the very interesting things he got up to, and one of those was he liked to sue people. I'm wondering if he's read the book and what sort of reaction he had, if he did contact you about it, or what's happened since then.
Yeah, so my dad was renowned as a vexatious litigant in the court system in Perth, and he was very well known, but not necessarily highly regarded. And he, yes, like he would sue people just for, I would joke, just for looking sideways at him. So when the book came out, it was during COVID, and Melbourne was, the most locked down city in the world. And I was homeschooling our 4 children and working from home, and forgot that the rest of the world actually existed because we're just in our bubble here in Melbourne. And so when my book came out, I hadn't actually told my dad that a book was coming out. And then my dad called me and said, "Oh, Mr. Wong down the road said that I'm on television." And I said, "Oh," because the ABC, the television station, was running an advertisement for my book, which was this beautiful animation with a lion and a tiger and photos of my dad and photos of me. And I just did not realize that he was going to find out about that. So anyway, so then I said, "Oh yes, I might have written a book." I said, "But whatever you do, Dad," and this was a red rag to a bull. I said, "Whatever you do, Dad, don't read it. Just wait until I come over to Perth, and then I can sit with you and we can read it together with love and with open hearts, and it will be wonderful." So then the next day I get a text message from my dad, and he says, "I've bought the book. It was very expensive. They didn't care who I was," meaning the bookshop didn't give it to him for free because the book was about him. "They didn't care who I was. It was $34.95 and it was a load of rubbish." And I said, "Dad," because this is the next day, I said, "Dad, how much have you read?" He said, "I'm up to page 17." And the next message I get from him, he says, "You should have mentioned all the court cases that I won." This whole time, because of what had happened in our past, and because my publishers, HarperCollins, were actually going to pull the book because they were concerned that my dad was going to sue them, and they had left it until the last minute to show the HarperCollins lawyers, because my publisher was really desperately hoping that it could get published, but then the lawyers at the last minute said no. There's a whole backstory in that as well. Anyway, it got published a bit later than scheduled. My dad read it. The final text message he sent me, my heart was beating out of my chest every single day, just thinking, what is he going to do? Is he going to sue me again? Is he going to sue the publisher? He's so predictably unpredictable. And then he messaged me and he said, "It's a load of rubbish. It's a load of Harry Potters, plural, but I think your ancestors would be proud."
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's surprising.
So I screenshotted the message and I sent it to my publisher, and she sent it to the lawyers.
and there haven't been any defamation proceedings since.
No.
I do get the feeling that your father is one of those people for whom any publicity is good publicity. And if he's on TV, it doesn't matter whether he's winning or losing or being ridiculed. He's on TV, which means people know about him, and that's good.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was at a doctor's appointment with him a couple of weeks ago when I was in WA, and he had very proudly gifted my book to his doctor and a specialist, a professor, and I said, "Oh, thank you so much for reading the book, Professor." And the doctor leaned in and said, "Mimi," and this is in front of my dad. He said, "Mimi, it was very courageous of you to write that book, and it was an amazing story, and it really gives me insight into your father because he's such a difficult patient." But he also said, it was very brave because your father isn't painted in the best light. And I thought
Mm.
that was a very interesting comment to make, and lots of people make that comment. But in reality, to what you just said, he doesn't perceive it as being a bad light because that
Mm.
is what he thinks is the only way to behave. So
Mm.
so I haven't said anything untrue, and in telling the truth, he agrees with the truth, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
He has like the opposite of imposter syndrome, doesn't he? Where he's just so aligned with himself that nobody else's opinion of him really matters, which is kind of a nice place to be.
It kind of is, and, on the one hand, it's delusional, but then on the other hand, what a happy place to be in, to just be so,
Mm.
asserted in your sense of self and
Mm.
who you are. Although, the reality is that, like everybody, he has his doubts, and I think underpinning that egotistical behavior and that, yearning and almost necessity in his personality to have to win all the time. I mean, that speaks to a little boy who wasn't heard growing up. He
Mm.
was the youngest boy of the 32 brothers and sisters. They would line
Mm.
up for a coin of pocket money, and he would say jokingly, but I know underneath the joke, it's quite sad that by the time it got to him, his dad had sometimes run out of coins.
I'm just wanted to follow up on that, Mimi, because I think, um, you obviously very challenging as a child growing up with your parents, and your mum had mental health issues, and your dad had his own way of doing things. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict, but it feels like you've been able to accept him through that understanding of his childhood. I just wanted to understand how you got to that point, because that's probably one of the big things in conflict is how do we let go or move on or accept the other person in our conflict situations. And that's often the sticking point is an acceptance of why that person might be acting as they are. And that doesn't mean you don't put in boundaries, of course. Are you at the point of acceptance, and how did you get to that point?
Mm. I'm definitely at the point of acceptance, and something you said just now was the two words, let go, and the letting go of many different things. So letting go of my expectation of what he should be as a father or who he should be. So letting go of my expectations, letting go of my desire for control over the situation, and allowing, whilst still, as you say quite rightly, Scott, having boundaries in place. Easier to say than to do, but definitely well worth working on. Letting go of the need to be right and the need to be seen and heard, because I think instinctively, and let's face it, most of us have some issues with our parents. And maybe we could say that the most intense relationship issues that we have in our lives are with our spouse and with our parents and then with our children. And so, whilst we can talk about professional workplaces and all of those sorts of things, which are also really important, it all stems from the family, and our familial relationships is where it starts. And then we kind of then turn and reflect our behaviours on the rest of the world and our relationships there.
Mm.
So, with my letting go of expectation and letting go of the way that I think or thought things should be, and that's another word to let go of, isn't it? Should,
Mhm. Yep.
um, and must, but particularly should, because we go through life thinking, well, this is how it should be, or that shouldn't happen to me, or this is what I should have done. And I think once I removed the word should from my vocabulary and let go of that, that was really great. And then the letting go, coming back to the letting go of being right, we are all so wedded and attached to being right. We don't even realize it. And often it's that not only being right, but it's just being seen and being heard and being understood. We want that, but we can't always have that. So to accept that I'm not always going to be able to prove myself to be right, because obviously I'm not always right as well, but I'm also not going to always be understood. And that is something that, as a human, I'm sure I'm like most people, and we go through life and we just want to be understood. And when we're misunderstood, then we suffer this feeling of not enoughness or inferiority or isolation, separation from others. And then we lose that deeper connection that we can actually have when we let go of that and understand that it's okay. Like it's that recognizing what is, accepting and allowing it, and then, if it's something difficult, then investigating what's underlying that. Is that my little girl who's not heard because I was living in a chaotic household with a mum who was living with schizophrenia, a dad who was narcissistic and had his various personality disorders? And so is that why I have maybe a greater degree of need or perceived need to be seen and heard than some other people who may have had a different experience? So letting go, that's it.
I just think that's really interesting because one of the biggest things I see, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, Sam, is that in a mediation, in a conflict, that's one of the most important parts for me, is that parties feel heard and understood. And when they don't, it's really hard to let go. So being able to actually accept that you may not be heard and understood or seen, and I think your father felt like that to a large degree too, and that was a lot of his behaviour stemming from that, from my understanding. That's really hard to do for many people. It's very hard to let go if you don't feel heard and understood of a conflict situation. So yeah, it takes, I don't know, it takes something more than, most people are able to, that they're more likely to sit in it if they don't feel that.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about the idea that we can only see and filter the world through our own eyes. And so
Mm,
if somebody else isn't seeing things the way that we see them, well, then of
mm,
course that's understandable. Their entire history of conditioning and existence and
yeah,
what has brought them to this place here and now is so completely, starkly different to my own. And so
mm,
why should I impose
mm,
my way of seeing the world on another person who has their right to see the world in their own way? So it takes a lot of work, and I think that's where, as you could both attest, that's where meditation and Buddhism comes in very handy.
What I hear really strongly that you're doing here, Mimi, is you're letting go of your attachment to how things should be and how people should be or ideally would be in your world. But you're also actively engaging with the conflict and how it makes you feel and your experiences with it, whereas many people tend to avoid it and pretend it's not happening and suppress it, which then comes out in unhelpful ways. But you, in some ways, have done that in an extreme way, in that not only have you engaged with it, done the inner work yourself, you've published a whole book about it. You sort of aired your family dirty laundry, which is a really brave thing to do. And I wondered what prompted you to share that with the world.
I was lucky in that my background is journalism and I've always loved writing. And before journalism stamped the creativity out of me to some extent, because, I went from really loving to write short stories and I one day wanted to be a writer. This is back when I was a little girl. And then journalism trained me, particularly broadcast journalism, trained me to keep my sentences short and sharp and to meet deadlines. And in news, you only have 60 seconds to tell a story. And then in current affairs, I had 5 minutes to tell a story that I may have spent weeks interviewing people for and cutting interviews an hour long, like our interview today, down to 20 seconds. So how do you do that? And so I had to go through a process of undoing that in order to write House of Qua. But the reason why it turned into a book is just a funny set of, I don't believe in coincidences. I think that everything kind of happens in the scale of everything everywhere all at once, and, energetic forces and all of that sort of stuff. But there were a series of events that happened in my life that led to my journaling, which was largely for legal purposes. When my dad was suing me in the Supreme Court, I was journaling things to have evidence of things that had happened, and I was keeping the letters that he sent me and screenshotting and recording the text messages that he was sending me. And also there was a conflict with one of my auntie's tenants in a property that she owned in Perth, where my dad went and lied to the tenants and said, if my daughter approaches you and says that she's the executor of my sister's will, my daughter's crazy, just ignore her. And so when I approached them, they thought that my dad had been telling them the truth. So they hung up the phone on me, and I couldn't understand why. And so then they eventually told me what my dad had told them once we got to the bottom of it. And so I had to record things like that and get statements from people like them. They weren't the only ones that my dad had told porky pies to. And so I was collating all of this stuff really to protect the will, and so that I could carry out my auntie's wishes. And then when we were in Hong Kong and scattering my auntie's ashes, we scattered my auntie's ashes in the harbour. And on the plane from Hong Kong to come back home, I started just writing bits and pieces in a more creative way. And I went to Manila on the way home and just visited a couple of friends. And my girlfriend there, who is a writer herself, she read just these few pages and she just looked at me and said, Mim, you have to write a book.
What would you say is the biggest or the most challenging conflict that you've had with your family, but also maybe professionally as well?
Well, I worked in commercial TV for a number of years, so it goes without saying that there were lots of both internal and external professional conflicts. For example, something that I could say, which would just be a daily conflict, would be the conflict of wanting to show and exercise integrity in reporting a story, but being told to report it in a particular way that served the commercial interests of the station. So I was working on what would have appeared to be an unfavourable story about a large car company, and I worked on that story for quite a few weeks. And when that car company found out that this story was happening, it went through to our advertising team at the commercial network, and then I was told, without any room for negotiation, that the story was got, and that was it. And there were other cases where there were conflict of interest, where I'd be sent to work on a story where it was sort of like, look over there, instead of look at where the story is. And I was like, no, but the story's here. And they're like, no, no, go and chase that butterfly over there and do the story on that. So I think as a journalist, that sort of conflict was difficult. So that caused inner conflict, but it also caused conflict in the office, as in real, shouting, argy-bargy conflict. But in those days, it was a case of, do you want to keep your job or don't you? And very sort of patriarchal, misogynistic environment. And so I chose to keep my job because I loved my job. So I would compromise my integrity from time to time to be able to keep doing what I love doing.
Mm, that's a tricky one.
Jerry, I was going to call you Teresa. Isn't that a funny Freudian slip? I was about to ask you about Teresa. One of the things that I do a lot in my work is what's called conflict coaching or conflict management coaching. So working with people in conflict one-on-one to help them, be clear about what's going on and make choices about how they can take some control over whatever happens next, maybe within, constraints imposed by the world around them. And as I was reading your book, I had this sense that in some ways your Aunt Teresa played a little bit of that role for you and maybe other family members. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about her role in sort of mediating, sort of coaching people through the family conflict, because it seemed like she was like a cog in the middle of a wheel of spokes out to the different parts of your family.
Yeah, she was very calm and very considered, but very open and warm at the same time. And when the rest of us were, flipping our lids over things, she would always just come up with something very, like, not irritating at all, because sometimes when when people come up with some sage wisdom in the midst of conflict, it can be very annoying. But she was never irritating or annoying. She would just sort of have, almost like not comparing her to the Dalai Lama, but, just that presence. She would have this beautiful presence about her where she could just say, oh, que sera, sera, or, oh, have you thought about what it's like to be in the beggar's shoes? Or, just something that would just snap you out of it. And you'd go, oh, wow, like it's not just about me. And she had that ability with her siblings as well. Although I did hear voices raised between my auntie and another auntie of mine more than once behind closed doors. So she could certainly lose her cool, like the best of us. But she was a sage ballast in my life as a little girl. And she was somebody who a lot of people have, fed back to me from reading my stories, somebody who really was my savior in such a tumultuous upbringing, which could have gone, could have led me to make choices to go in a completely different direction to what I did. And I think having her there as this sort of omnipotent force in my life to just gently guide me, even though I didn't see her every day, I just saw her a few times a year in Hong Kong or when she visited Australia. But just her presence was always with me. And I think you almost calling me Teresa just now, that's a great compliment to me. People say, oh, you have your Auntie Teresa's poise, or you have your Auntie Teresa's character or warmth or something. And I just think, oh my gosh, that is just the greatest compliment that anybody could ever give me.
Yeah.
I just want to look into that mindfulness stuff, that we mentioned at the start, because I just think that's really interesting. You've gone down that path, and sort of what led you to sort of exploring that path. And, from my experience, so I had lost my parents when I was young. So my dad died when I was 1 and my mum died when I was 12. And so grew up with my stepfather. We fought a lot. And so I ended up a fairly unhappy person, and that sort of led me to exploring sort of mindfulness and meditation, going to India and going to an ashram over there. And it was really the suffering that sort of drew me there, my own suffering and depression and things like that. And I'm wondering what led you to going down that sort of mindfulness path, because I would imagine there would be quite a lot of suffering from your experiences, not only as a child, but continuing on, you've had to deal with a lot. So yeah, I'd just be interested to know what sort of led you along that path.
Well, short answer, my dad's suing me. But longer answer is that from what I can gather, suffering is what opens the portal for the opportunity for any of us to awaken. And it's not that you can't awaken to yourself. And by awaken, I mean have the introspection and the self-awareness to be conscious of our behavior and our conditioning, and to be able to shed some of that and figure out who we really are at our core and our essence. So in terms of awakening or developing some sort of conscious awareness, that can be done without suffering, but more often than not, it is through suffering that we arrive at that desire. So for me, it was hitting a rock bottom place mentally in my relationship with my dad and a few other just, icing on top of the cake or cherry on top of the icing on top of the cake situations in my life.
Hmm.
And doing yoga one day on my balcony and just being at that point where I tried so many modalities to support my healing. I had been to see my beautiful psychologist. I had been to, acupuncturists and massage, and I felt that I tried so many different things, and then, herbal remedies, reading books, but it was just this moment of collapsing in a heap, crying, doing my yoga, where I just felt this sort of blackness overcome me and felt like I'd hit this rock bottom and just felt this suffering is too much. There must be something else. And in that moment of, uh, I guess, thinking there must be some other way. It's like this desperation. In that moment of desperation, just something opened up to me, and I just sort of breathed, and I felt this great presence. And whether you want to call it, energy or universe or God or whatever it was, I just felt a peacefulness just for a moment, and then it went. And I think getting that glimpse of what could be just made me very curious about
Mm.
meditation. Because yoga in itself is a form of meditation, but you can also do yoga and not be present at all
Mm.
and just move through the motions. So I really became very interested in mindfulness. It's a buzzword. Lots of people talk about it, but I started to read deeply about it, and I picked up A Course in Miracles, which is an amazing book. I picked up Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth and The Power of Now. I've just recently read A Radical Awakening by Dr. Shafali. So the learning continues. And in the last 2 years, I took on a 2-year mindfulness meditation teaching course that I did with the University of California, Berkeley, and that was with Tara Brach and Jack Cornfield, and that was incredible. And so I think that when we see ourselves as lifelong learners, and for me, when I found this interest and curiosity around meditation, it's just taken me down this really beautiful rabbit hole where I'm like Alice in Wonderland and just discovering different types of meditation and different practitioners and different teachers, and just using that as yet another tool in my toolbox to just be able to be comfortable with the suffering and the things that happen in life, and to expand my window of tolerance for what happens, because we can't change the happenings. We can't change those events that happen to us or around us, but we can change ourselves. And so once I realized that doing the inner work through meditation was a way to be able to change and alter myself, my patterns, my pathways, to unblock my trauma, my chakras, whatever you want to talk about, I'm here for it.
It's so true, though, isn't it? A lot of my clients come to me and they hope I have this magic wand that can make the other person disappear or turn them into a different person or change the constraints that are preventing them from getting what should be. And it's sometimes really confronting for them to realize that really the only thing they have control over is themselves. And I'm there to help them think about what they might do differently, and it suddenly feels like a whole lot of hard work. And it takes a certain sort of person to be able to go through that uncomfortableness and putting themselves out there.
Hey, Mimi, we know you've been on television a lot and you've interviewed a lot of different people. What is, if you're willing to share, one celebrity that you've had some trouble with, maybe even conflict?
Well, that actually is quite an easy question to
Good.
answer, because my first day, are you ready for a story?
Oh,
It's
yeah. We
it's
want
long, but
stories. We want gossip.
it's worth it. So my first day at Channel 9, I was sent out to interview Russell Crowe, and this was in Gladiator days. Like, he was up for an Oscar. He was the most famous celebrity on the planet at the time, and I was sent to interview him. Apparently, I had the exclusive interview. Little did I know that it was a bit of a hazing ritual at Channel
Oh,
9 because I was the new girl. But I went off all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to the airport with my camera crew, and I wondered why there was no one else around. And then I thought, oh, yeah, that's right. I've got the exclusive interview, right? And then it started to dawn on me that maybe Russell Crowe didn't know that I had the exclusive interview, because there was a driver standing with a signboard saying Mr. Dumbrell. And it was, driver with a cap, obviously a limousine driver. And I thought, oh, maybe he's traveling under an assumed name. And this was me, young investigative journalist, very, very green around the gills. And Russell Crowe got off the plane, and I thought really quickly on my feet. So I thought, and I said, "Hi, Mr. Dumbrell, how are you?" And he gave me like his Hando romper stomper look, like, "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm Mimi. I'm from the ABC." I could not even remember which station I was from.
oh
I was
no.
nervous. So I said that I was from the ABC, and then he just looked at me because I was with a camera crew that had Channel 9 emblazoned all over. And he said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Channel 9. It's my first day," and blah, 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 blah. And I just, was tripping over my words. Anyway, meantime, he keeps walking with a friend through Tullamarine, and it's like the sea is parting for Moses, because everybody's noticed, oh my gosh, that is Russell Crowe. And there's a camera crew, and everybody at Tullamarine Airport at peak hour is just all eyes on us. And so my camera crew is walking backwards through the airport. I'm walking next to Rusty, trying to find out how he enjoyed the Olympics. And before I left my news bureau, I was told that I needed to find out whether he and Meg Ryan were going to get married. So here's me innocently thinking that he's going to tell me. So I'm walking through the airport, and I said, "So, any wedding bells with Meg Ryan?" He just looked at me and he just went, "F off, you're an effing parasite." So then I was just so innocent, because I'd been at the ABC for some time, and all I'd ever done was political stories and, very serious stories. This was the first celebrity story I'd ever done. First of many, thank goodness. But he just looked at me, and then he just walked off, and I burst into tears because I'd just been told to F off by the most famous actor on the planet. And and also, it wasn't even just that he was a famous actor. It was awful energetically to be told, where to go, and to be have someone so angry with me. So he walked off, and there's a thing in TV way back when that you couldn't sell the footage or commercialize it if the celebrity changed outfits, because it would have no continuity. So he walked into a shop, bought a new outfit, and then walked out in his new outfit. It was into the Rip Curl shop or something at Tullamarine. And so my camera crew's filming, but to edit that, it would look a bit silly because suddenly it's gone from one outfit to another. And so my camera crew's following. I'm still crying on the steps in the airport. And I get back to Channel 9, and I put the tape in the machine, and my hands are shaking, and about 60 people are gathered around because everybody's heard the new girl's gone to interview Russell Crowe. And everybody from, marketing and from HR and all these sales department and my newsroom. And remember, this is my first day. I don't know anyone. I might know some of the on-air talent just because I've seen them on air, but I don't know them. So I'm sitting there on my first day. I put this tape in, and everybody's watching me humiliate myself, walking beside Russell Crowe, trying to find out whether he's getting married to Meg Ryan. After these photos, were leaked of him on the balcony with her at the Sydney Olympics. Anyway, and so all my, new colleagues are watching this footage, me crying. Then it cuts to him getting into his car, and he looks down the barrel of the camera and he says, "Mimi, I hope you find something useful to do with your life." And I'm seeing that for the first time with my entire newsroom. And everybody's laughing, and I'm just mortified because here's this guy saying, I hope you find something useful to do with your life, implying this is not a useful thing. So very interestingly, um, 6 months later, had already interviewed Serena Williams by then, and ABBA, and Pierce Brosnan, and Ralph Schumacher, and like I'd interviewed lots of celebrities by this stage, and somehow I got the job of entertainment reporter. Goodness knows how after that interview with Russell Crowe. Anyway, my boss says to me 6 months later, Mimi, you're going out to interview Russell Crowe. And I said, no, I'm not. Still having anxiety attacks every time I went past a billboard with Russell Crowe on it, and there were lots of them because he was doing lots of movies around that time. Every time I went into, remember those shops called video shops? Every time I went into Blockbuster Video, there he was, on the shelves. There he was on the cover of magazines at Coles. I just couldn't go anywhere without seeing his face, and I would have anxiety every time I saw him because of that interaction and the impact that it had on me. So this day, 6 months later, my boss says, you're going to interview Russell Crowe. I say, no, I'm not. He said, well, if you don't, you lose your job. I said, okay, I'll go. So I went to interview Russell Crowe. It was a room full of journalists, and long story short, during the whole press conference, every time I looked up, every answer that he gave to another journalist, he just looked straight at me, giving the answer. And I thought to myself, I must be imagining things and going completely bonkers at this stage. And every time I sort of looked up, and I was at the back as well, hiding behind my notebook. And every time I looked up, he was looking at me, and I thought, okay, I'm not going crazy. This is my opportunity to face my demons and put this to bed. And so at the end, everybody else was packing up. All of the other journalists were leaving, and a lot of them were lining up to get an autograph with Rusty. And I've always found that, well, I think probably nowadays I would, or I'd get a selfie or something. But at the time, I had this integrity that I'm a journalist there to do my work, and it's not about getting an autograph. So I sort of poo-pooed that. That was a bit of a judgment from me. Now, I stood at the back of the line, and when I got to the front of the line, I was the last one there. Everybody else had left except for me and my camera crew. And I said, hi, and he said, you're Mimi Kwa. I know exactly who you are. Who do you think vetted the list of journalists to come in here? And I said, well, I just want to say that I'm really sorry for ambushing you in the airport and invading your personal space and your privacy. And I just wanted to apologize. And he said, I have been chased around the world in Rome and London and New York by journalists. And he said, no one has ever apologized. And he put his hand out and he said, I'm Russell. And I shook his hand and he said, let's start again. And that was my conflict resolution story with.
Wow.
And I have found something useful to do with my life now. Thank you.
Oh, what a wonderful story.
That's fabulous.
And thanks for the tip too. So when Scott and I do become famous, we will know to have spare sets of clothing and to change them regularly when we're being chased by paparazzi. That's a really good tip.
Yes, that is the trick.
And are you friends now or what?
Well, I wouldn't say that we're friends, but we have mutual friends.
Okay.
And definitely not friends, but that was an encounter that, we were friendly. And I'm sure that if I saw him again, he would remember.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
we would be friendly now.
And it's funny, that wasn't where I was expecting you to go with the story. I was expecting you to call him on how poorly he treated you and for swearing at you, but you took the higher ground and apologised for invading his private moment. And he didn't choose to do that either. Let's face it, you were tricked into doing that. But you didn't try and justify yourself or deflect blame. You owned how it felt for him and acknowledged that and apologised for it. So what a brilliant way and a perfect ending to that story.
Thank you. Maybe I did know something back then. That's helped me now too.
We usually ask our guests at the end of the episode about whether they have any conflict pearls, but I feel in your case we should ask if there's any silken linings in conflict.
When I did see my dad for, I think, the first time after the book came out, I sat with him and this is once I discovered meditation. I sat with him and I held his hands and I looked him in the eye and I said, "Thank you, Dad, for suing me, because if you hadn't sued me, I would never have gone down the path of finding out about your past and what makes you you, and I would never have dealt with so much of my own past. So thank you so much." And at first, I could just see him resist what I was saying. But then, as he sat and as I kept speaking this sincere gratitude to him and telling him how much I love him and how much I'm grateful to him for surviving his childhood and for just the miracle of me being here at all, he really softened into that. And for the first and probably only time, we really connected soulfully, energetically in that moment. And having that presence, holding that presence with him was priceless and indescribable.
Amazing. That's amazing, because that's really about forgiveness, isn't it? That ability with an open heart, like to be able to forgive and appreciate and be grateful for what he's done, which sounds on the one hand so inappropriate. And to be able to get to that stage is pretty amazing, I think.
It's even beyond forgiveness because, as you mentioned, it's the gratitude, because forgiveness in itself, and I've done a little bit of reading into forgiveness and psychoanalyze myself around it and everybody else. And just by virtue of the term forgiveness, that is an indicator of superiority. You know, I forgive you your sin.
Mm,
And
mm,
so where I arrived was at what I believe is, you know, the crux of it is that really there is nothing to forgive. He was
mm.
behaving in the best way that he knew how to behave.
Yeah.
And, you know, whether we judge that, because forgiveness is an indicator of judgment, isn't it? And so I'm working, like many of us, on
Mm,
judging, and we live in a world full of judgment, you know, many judgments in every moment every day. But
mm,
that and some of them are helpful, but some of them are very unhelpful. And so my judging my dad as being wrong in his behavior or his thinking was unhelpful. And so once I even got past that forgiveness, so you're right, I did forgive him open-heartedly, but when I got past that and was able to step into pure
mm,
gratitude, that was where the real magic started to happen.
mm.
Mm.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's great, and it's deepened a connection, hasn't it? It's not just repaired a fracture, but it's deepened your connection on a different level.
It has. He still sends me incessant long essay text messages, but now it's about me and how I deal with it because, you know,
Yeah.
as you mentioned before, Sam, it's not about making the person stop or go away. You know, I wish I could make him cease and desist sometimes, but it's about me. I don't have to read it. I don't have to read it today. I don't
Yeah.
have to respond today. I don't have to read it tomorrow. I've actually got a text message literally sitting there right now, which I've just glanced at. I can see is an essay. And I thought, I'm going to wait till the weekend, till I've got a little bit of space, and then I'll read it and I will mindfully respond.
Maybe we
That
could read it out now, Mimi, and we can work through it together.
Help
great.
me draft my response.
There's that great Buddhist phrase, isn't there, that you don't have to take unwanted gifts. You don't have to accept them. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, that when other people do things in ways that are unhelpful for you, you don't have to take them on. You can just let them sit there. Mimi, you have been such an inspiration. I honestly think we could talk to you for ages. And I really recommend all our viewers and listeners read the book, because apart from the fact that it's a great story, it's really a fantastic story. There are so many lessons and and things that we can learn about your family, but also ourselves, because I think we can see ourselves reflected in many of the characters and many of the situations. So thank you so much for writing it and for being with us today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's just been so lovely to chat with you both. Thank you for indulging all of my meditation interests too.
Thank you, Mimi. Really appreciate your openness and honesty. It's refreshing and so many takeaways. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both for being you and doing the work that you're doing. I think we're all, we're all moving in the same direction, and awakening really is our only purpose in life. Sometimes challenging and frustrating as it might be, that's all part of our own evolution too, isn't it? So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone watching and listening, keep on working towards a more peaceful future.
And enjoy your conflict.
Thanks, Mimi.
Thank you both.